Welcome everyone. This is the TASBot MAGFest panel for Friday. Thanks for coming. We're going to have a little talk here about what we've been working on with Game Boy emulation over the last almost 6 years now, as I've been speedrunning and TASing and doing stuff since the Twitch plays Pokemon and Pokemon plays Twitch era. So let's get this kicked off. This is over on the far, your left here. This is Vigray Tech. Veteran of NES emulation and homebrew development specifically. And we've got Dwango AC, the keeper of TASBot, to my stage left. I can never, my left and right's completely screwed up right now. And then we have Taters on this side here. So Taters is our project manager for the TASBot team. And I'm TyKevin83. I'm going to be walking you through what we've been working on with emulation. So this talk's going to be about what has been essential to making TASBot work with the GameCube and Game Boy player setup for making as many as 50 or 60 games now able to be played back on original cartridges on console. And it's going to be giving some of the history and background of the emulation scene and how we've gotten to where we are now. So a background, why is emulator precision and accuracy important? Our RTA speedrunning communities actually rely on this quite a bit for RNG manipulation and very precise wall clips. You'll hear often of things like in Pokemon Coliseum on an emulator, a wall clip was found once, but nobody's ever been able to replicate it on console. So if that difference is there, what value is the clip to the speedrunning community? Or you could have the opposite effect where a wall clip might not be found on emulator that is happening on console. And if those differences are there, then somebody might have to spend a lot more money to get a console set up, where even a Pokemon Coliseum disc on its own is like a $200 investment these days. So it's pretty helpful if the emulators are working accurately. Second, the TAS scene is heavily reliant on accurate emulation for both accurately timing TASes, but then also for the process of console verification, where we want to feed those TASes back into a console. If it's not accurate, that's not going to work. And so we need that very precise accuracy to be able to take finished TASes made by these amazing TAS offers we have across TAS videos and feed them back into TASes. And then we also want to be able to feed back improvements found in TASes to speedrunners. And if those speedrunners are using consoles and the TAS authors have to use emulators, that's not going to work very well either. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the topic history here. There's a period from the late 90s to the early 2010s with a background of the history of console emulation in general, not even just for TASing. This is when emulation was starting and people were thinking about emulation for the first time. Leading up to the early 2010s when people were really starting to think about how can we make these emulators more accurate. And then in 2015, Dwango AC detailed deficiencies in some of the old Super Game Boy approaches to TASing with Pokemon Plays Twitch. And Dwango's going to have some great stories for that.
Oh, man, I have so many great stories. Can you guys hear me all right? Oh, yeah, sure. These mics are a little hot, so. So here's basically what happened. In 2014, we were setting up for something crazy we were doing at Awesome Games Done Quick 2015, I believe is the right event. And it involved taking Pokemon Red and somehow figuring a way to play it in a way that we could use the cartridge inside of a Super Game Boy, inside of a Super Nintendo, so that we could connect TASBot to that, so that we could then do something. We weren't really sure on the plan, but...
Yep. So we'll get that full story in a bit, but that was definitely an adventure.
Yeah. Do you want me to talk about the accuracy issues?
Not for a bit. We got a couple bits here to get through first with the chronology. I'm trying to do this chronologically so it makes a little bit sense because there's a lot of very detailed and technical aspects to this. So in the early 1990s, the first emulators actually were not doing anywhere near what we could do now with accuracy because they used something called high-level emulation. So what's really cool about high-level emulation is you can play almost any game for a game, even like the N64, on equivalent era hardware like a PC without losing too many frames. So you could play, even in the early and late 90s, you could play SNES and N64 games on PC hardware of the same era with, I think, HLE is it Project HLE? Yeah, there were a lot of N64 emulators using that approach. So you could play things like Super Mario 64 and a PC even back in the late 90s. Hold on just a second here.
Still can't play Conker's Bad Fur Day. It's impossible.
Is that not working even in current emulators?
I'm saying this now to a bunch of people who are going to go, yeah, you can totally do it now.
I know Pokemon Snap even recently has had a hard time because the picture detection for Snap requires extreme accuracy, and there's a couple of emulators in RetroArch that are starting to get to a point of being able to do it.
Nice.
So this side effect, though, being able to run those high-level emulations on a PC meant that running at full speed, it wasn't able to get the really tight quirks of the original hardware. So something like undefined behavior, if it tries to read from a inaccessible area of RAM, that's not gonna work correctly in a high-level emulator where all you're trying to do is, I wanna paint Mario red here and with this specific color face and hat. That's all it's worried about. It's not worried about if it messes up one pixel in one area. So the approach with high-level emulation is much less useful for speedrunning, where those very precise pixel drawings and things like wall clips have to be exact, and timing to hardware is critical. Another interesting bit here is that concept that's usually talked about with high-level emulation, where you are making a game in its entirety run on a PC, is not even as high level as you can get. You can actually go higher level with things like ScumVM. So ScumVM will let you play games like Backyard Baseball, Maniac Mansion, a whole bunch of these really old, I think even some of the early Myst games were released in a Scum emulator. Not emulator, but a Scum engine. And the engine can actually be fully replaced. So there's an even higher level technique done in those games where the scripting engine is completely pulled out from the original game code and replaced with a scripting engine that's more portable for a PC. So games like Backyard Baseball that were intended to be released for the PC can be played on the N64, the DS, the 3DS, the Switch, like any console, any system, because somebody's rewritten the entire game engine in a more portable version. So that's really useful for making a game work, but it's not as useful for making a game work perfectly so that we can play the original games back on the systems they were designed for. So that gets us to low-level emulation. And this started to come out through the mid-2000s, where people were trying to implement individual components of console hardware instead of just trying to make the game run. And to do that, you have to emulate the internal quirks of every component. So if somebody tries to access a pixel from the pixel processing unit on the Game Boy at the wrong time, it'll stop working now instead of just drawing what the game code is trying to do. And this allows you to match undefined behavior and very, very specific hardware bugs. And at the extreme end of this, you can even get down to emulating not just entire chips like the pixel processing unit, the GPU, the CPU, these chips. You can actually go down to emulate every transistor. So there's projects like Visual 6502 that have taken transistor diagrams from the NES and run them through hardware description languages and have an entire emulator built out of descriptions of the individual transistor level. So now you might be thinking, that sounds really useful if you can be that accurate by describing every transistor. Why don't we just do that? The problem is it's really slow. Even on like a modern off-the-shelf, you can't find it 3090 Ti or like a 5950X. You take one of those out and try to run a transistor level emulator on it, and it's not even gonna run the full speed of the NES. The transistor level emulators are really, really slow. And also, once you get past the NES, the transistors are so small that it's extremely difficult to take pictures of them to even understand the original layout that was done on the console. So getting those quirks is really complicated, and you might not even be able to document them for a newer system. So moving the low-level emulation approach to newer consoles, it's not really possible or feasible to use that low level of a technique. So this gets us to a period in early around, I want to say around 2002, where people were building these low-level emulators, and they wanted to found a way to describe across all the different emulators that existed at the time, how do we standardize and figure out what those quirks were on the hardware and what those behaviors that we need to emulate at low level are. And this was a period in the software development community in general where a thing called unit testing was being invented. And the idea there is you take very short segments of code and you run it just against a specific instruction. So maybe you're trying to add two values, trying to add 10 and 15 and get 25. And maybe you're trying to add 10.00001 and 10.00002, and on the original console, instead of getting a 3 in their little rounding bit, you get a 4 because it rounds something wrong. So that's where you need these extremely specific test ROMs to test very specific behaviors of the original instructions. And Blarg and Cinemas in early, I want to say early 2010s, like June 2010, were building test automation suites where they would take pictures of the results of all of these test ROMs, thousands and thousands of pictures, and make a portrait of this is the stuff that we need to get emulated accurately to get a accurate NES.
Even in general, so for instance, the NES has a lot of quirks. A lot of them tend to be graphical. So for instance, there can only be 8 sprites on a scan line. So if you have a sprite here and a sprite here, this in-between chunk will just be gone if there's more than 8 sprites. Everything underneath it will end up showing up, which is why in some games you'll have blinking of sprites. The game will essentially reorder which sprites are where in order to give each of them equal time. Other games, as soon as enough sprites are in a row, you'll just like see this bar of missing sprites. There's also issues. For instance, one test I've ended up noticing, there's early emulation of the processor on the NES. It's based on the 6502 microprocessor. That has a mode called binary coded decimal. So you can count 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then it goes back down to 0. There's counting that's not binary coded decimal, so it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, A, B, C, D, E, F, 10. So you can continue up until you can get to 255 in binary hexadecimal. If an emulator is not written correctly for the NES, if you set binary coded decimal mode on, the NES did not have the transistors set for binary coded decimal to be legally distinct from the 6502, so they didn't have to pay licensing to Commodore. So if an emulator is built based on the 6502 instead of the offshoot that the NES used, a test could count, like set binary coded decimal mode, okay, let's count all the way up to 9, count one more, and on an inaccurate emulator, it will be essentially 10 as the value. On an accurate emulator, it will be 10. On an inaccurate emulator, it will be 0. And that can completely change how games run. If you need like a score to be a 0 at a spot and it's 10 instead, that can really start breaking things.
And games would use things like binary coded decimal for scores because it was easier to do those sorts of calculations and show the results on screen, right? Awesome. So let me move along here. And then in the period where these test ROMs were being developed in the early 2010s, a whole bunch of people started building their own accurate emulators, especially for the Game Boy. So you have emulators like BGB by Beware, which is really focused on debugging capabilities. Same Boy by Leor, which is really trying to get the sound of and the look of the Game Boy exact, even at very, very tight levels. Like it's trying to measure even the interference of the screen on the electricity of the sound pipelines in the Game Boy. So when you turn on the Game Boy, you get a little buzz in the background. It's actually interference from the LCD coming over the sound chip. So Same Boy can actually even emulate that sound effect because it's doing things so close to the electrical level. And there are two other ones, Emulation by Calendro and Beaten Dying Moon by Matt Curry, which are all trying to do this sort of test ROM-based, very accurate emulation strategy. But the strategy hadn't really taken hold yet in speedrunning circles, and that's where I'm going to want Dwango AC here to do a little bit more discussion on Pokemon Plays Twitch, which happened in 2015. Was that a Games Done Quick presentation, Dwango?
It was, and all of the work happened in 2014. It was a crazy experience. So at the time, we needed to do some really weird things. First of all, one of the requirements was we needed to be able to connect TASBot to the controller ports, which was really hard to do on a portable unit. How do you plug TASBot into a Game Boy? The answer, by the way, is messy, don't do it. So what we did is we cheated. We put the Pokemon cartridge in a Super Game Boy, the Super Game Boy cartridge inside of a Super Nintendo, and then plugged TASBot into that. But the problem is there were no accurate emulators. BSNES emulated the Super Game Boy, kind of, but not really the linkage between the communication of the Super Game Boy and the, say, an emulator, say a Game Boy emulator inside of it. It was like the communication between the Super Nintendo and the Super Game Boy, yeah, that worked, kinda, but not the actual rest of it. So Ilari, who's an amazing emulator coder, took the BSNES core plus some of his own code, combined it with Gambatte, I think is the right name of it, libgambatte, and slooged it all together, managed to make it work, sort of. Here's one of the issues we ran into. I don't know if you've ever used a Super Game Boy. It was this weird cartridge you could slot in and then put your own Game Boy cartridges in, and it would show a Game Boy on the screen, and it worked. But there's one minor problem that I think you might be able to talk to a little bit better about the clock skew between a 6502 and a Z80.
So the main clock on the Super Nintendo is based off of essentially it runs a little bit higher than 60 frames per second. It's like 60.0893 frames per second. CRTs, it's close enough to 59.97 or whatever frames per second that it just deals with it. It's fine. The Game Boy runs a little under 60 frames per second, and that doesn't really like to work well together.
So imagine for a moment that you're an emulator coder trying to code for this bizarre behavior where the original hardware, every 56 or 57 frames, would either duplicate your inputs from the previous frame, or if you had no input on the previous frame, it would just lose the next bit of input. So if you are actually playing competitively, don't use a Super Game Boy. It will lose your input once per second if you happen to be unlucky enough to hit on that 1 in 60 chance, basically. So not only is it weird on the original hardware, emulating that weirdness is a complete nightmare.
Because of having to do that chain of, not only do you need to emulate the Super Game Boy, the little cartridge accurately that has an entire Game Boy on it, you have to emulate the Super Nintendo that's running the Super Game Boy accurately to get the whole pipeline of this input does this to the Super Nintendo, which does this to the Super Game Boy.
And in 2014, let me tell you, it wasn't there. We ended up just blindly guessing. Every test took about 5 minutes. We would run through it on the physical hardware. It wouldn't match what we saw in the emulator. We'd make some educated guesses on what to do, tweak a little bit, try again. It must have been 30, 40 hours of testing before we finally found if we added the correct number of blank frames, of not putting any input in, we could get everything to align just right so that we could get the result we expected on real hardware. But we knew that there was a huge gap between what we had emulated and how the real hardware worked. And that was a big problem. We wanted to fix that. So
Yep, so after Pokemon Plays Twitch happened, there was a real change in the Pokemon speedrunning community that kicked off a new era in emulation accuracy. And let me just advance here. So this is the 2016 to present era in Game Boy emulation. And let me get my, okay, so the background here is the Game Boy became a focus as a platform for speedrun accurate emulation, because in 2016, the Pokemon speedrunning scene switched from in-game time to tracking real-time records. And this meant that hard resetting the console was now accounted for in timing, because You could just leave a timer going on your computer, and it would still track how long the run was going, even though you were not playing the game, of course, while the console was hard resetting. So now this was allowed to do the hard resets, and when you hard reset the console, it resets the RNG back to its initial state, which meant that it was very easy to just play perfectly for a couple of seconds and get a perfect Pokemon. So we needed to find, in an emulator, a pathfinding algorithm to find these best Pokemon after a couple seconds of perfect play, and also some paths to not get any encounters through things like Mount Moon, where you've got this long stretch where you would really rather not encounter any Pokemon at all. So in order to even be able to run those pathfinding algorithms, we needed exact cycle timings to every input to match between the console and the emulator. And we needed this to be emulated fast as well, not just like I was talking about with the transistor level emulators, where you could do it really slowly. We needed it to be extremely fast because a pathfinding algorithm is going to need to iterate and repeatedly back up and go forward again to look for these paths to perfect Pokemon. So this is where console revision specific behaviors became really important. Speedrunners standardized on using the Game Boy Player hardware, which I have in front of you now.
The Game Boy Player emulator.
The Game Boy Player hardware, very important, because the black brick down here is actually the entire internals of a Game Boy Advance, and it's just using direct memory transfers to the GameCube to communicate the video and audio output, and then likewise and vice versa for the inputs from the GameCube to go to the Game Boy Player. So we had to standardize on this hardware because we needed exactly one hardware revision of the Game Boy for everyone to be playing on for the manipulation that we did for RNG to work for everyone. And we based our emulator around Gambatte, which uses low-level emulation techniques to emulate each, think like the pixel processing unit and the CPU on the Game Boy, but it uses an event system instead of trying to step through every single cycle, and it only is cycle accurate to the point of every event, which is really what we need because events like input are where we need to be cycle accurate when we're trying to do console verification. So Extra Tricky and Enter Pinter and Gifvex and DeBombstew are some big names in the Pokemon speedrunning community, and they reverse engineered a really important behavior here, which is that the Game Boy Advance has a different iteration of the Game Boy Color BIOS than the original Game Boy Color did. This is because they wanted to be able to have games like Shantae, a Game Boy Color game that was very rare. It was made very late in the life of the Game Boy Color because it was also the Game Boy Advance was out. And they wanted Shantae and other games like it to be able to show different graphics to tune for the colors of the Game Boy Color versus the different colors you would see if you played the same game on the LCD that is on the Game Boy Advance. And they would also, I think there were some special maps that you could use in the links, is it Link to the Past?
The Oracle games.
Oracle games,
Yeah,
yeah.
Oracle Seasons and Oracle Ages.
Exactly. Those have some special maps that you can only use if it detects from the BIOS in the Game Boy Advance at startup. So this is really important to get that different BIOS. And they actually, this whole team of Pokemon speedrunners reverse engineered those differences and figured out what was going on the Game Boy Player, which has the Game Boy Advance's hardware and not the Game Boy Color's hardware. And then, of course, the Game Boy Color is a revision of the Game Boy. So you can see how these revisions stack up, and it's very important to target a specific one. They also reverse engineered the initial divider state. So the divider is how Pokemon tracks its RNG, and if you are starting from 0, you'd think that a thing that tracks time would start from 0, but no, it's actually, it starts at 2 because it needs to prefetch instructions, and that's really important to emulate that accurately. And also some details around how it boots out of the stop mode, because there's a stop mode you can do where you completely stop doing anything of calculation on the CPU on the Game Boy.
Takam and I actually had mentioned recently about, so there's a very big difference between something like the Super Nintendo and the NES compared to the Game Boy. The Super Nintendo and the NES, when you start a game up, it essentially fetches where the game starts on Power Up, and then it just starts playing. The Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance has this little screen where Nintendo pops down, or for Game Boy Advance, you see Game Boy Advance like flash on the screen. So that's the BIOS of the system. That takes up time, and that has to be emulated accurately, and that's not in the cartridge. That is in the hardware of the console itself.
Another cool thing that happened with the advent of this Pokemon speedrunning change to the in-game time, or from the in-game time to RTA, was for Gen 2, they had to account for the clock that happens on the Gen 2 Pokemon cartridges. There is a separate driven clock that tracks day-night cycles on Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal. And if you don't emulate that at a low level, you don't get the right time. And if you don't get the right time, then the RNG is calculated after a different amount of time has passed. And it builds up into this whole problem. So what they actually did was they implemented low-level emulation of the cartridge's real-time clock, which allowed them to do things like, oh, the cartridge that we're using to do this verification runs at 3.999 instead of 4 megahertz. And so at the point where it hits this tile in the game, we're calculating this value for the in-game time, which does this different thing to the RNG, and then you get an encounter where you don't on the emulator. And so we were able to implement actually multiple clocks happening between the cartridge and the Game Boy player by adjusting for offsets like that. And other details in this whole process finished all of the RTA applications for Pokemon Gen 1 and 2 accurate emulation. So then in 2018, that's 4 years ago? 4 years ago, jeez.
Time.
I discovered a glitch called fast options in Pokemon Yellow. You might not know this, but actually if you hit the A button at the same time that you hit the left button on the options screen, when you enter the options, all of them will be shifted to the left. Or vice versa, if you hit the right button at the same time you hit the A button to open options, the options all shift to the right. And I was like, that's cool. I want to make that happen in a TAS because I don't think anybody's used that in a TAS before, and it would make the TAS faster. It's a free win that I found that to make the TAS faster. So I wanted to implement it, and I started researching the glitchless TASing of Pokemon Yellow. I made a glitchless TAS, which was able to be played back on console due to all these improvements to the emulator I was talking about with the precisions and things like cartridge RTC and all of those quirks that they made work for the Pokemon RTA community. And we backported them to BizHawk. So BizHawk is it's basically a framework for emulating a whole bunch of different systems. And it had a version of Gambatte in it that was really, really old because the original author, Cinemas, hadn't maintained it in a long time. And so we took in all these Pokemon reverse engineering experts, and we had them basically redesign the Gambatte core inside of BizHawk to have the same innovations that we were using to do those path searching algorithms and get accurate encounters for RNG manipulation. So then the TASing could be as accurate as we were doing for RTA speedrunning. And at the same time as all that was happening, Extremes is also building Game Boy Interface, which I have in front of you here in this SD card. It's a homebrew replacement for the Game Boy Player's startup disc, and hopefully we'll have a quick demo of that playing back live here after the end of the panel. But what it does is it allows you to inject inputs from files on the SD card into the Game Boy Player, and that's really, really useful because then we can not have to worry about things like actually trying to send inputs over the controller port into the GameCube and then have those interpreted correctly and then sent to the Game Boy Player. It basically just stamps them by this amount of time has passed on the Game Boy Player, and the GameCube keeps track of how much time has passed on the Game Boy Player by watching the audio output. So it'll watch, it'll watch, this number of seconds of audio have been emitted from the Game Boy Player. That means I can know that it's running at this clock speed, so I can send this input at this time.
And it is frustratingly accurate. Like, it is incredibly precise at what point you want your input to happen on this particular CPU cycle. We will stick that input at this particular CPU cycle.
So you might be thinking then, okay, that's it, right? That you figured it out, you got it to work. Well, not quite. When we actually tried to play back the tasks, it emulated 2 billion CPU instructions perfectly and then failed. So that's going to be a problem. How do you sift through 2 billion instructions and figure out which one went wrong? And that's really where I was really excited about this talk, because this story was so fun. What they did was they took the Pokemon Yellow disassembly that had been done by Pret, the Pokemon reverse engineering team, and they stripped out part of its input loop and replaced it with the input log. So in the actual ROM of this ROM hack was the entire input of the task. And they also stripped out an equivalent number of cycles. They basically optimized the game just enough so that it ran exactly as fast as the original game in CPU cycles, to the point of every RNG instruction. And they also, in all of that, inserted into the save data basically like a trailing log of the last 30 seconds, how many cycles have passed on the Game Boy to this frame. And this allowed us to identify an exact frame where a CPU cycle count difference happened between the emulator and the console. And what we did then was, now we have identified, oh, this frame is where the difference in cycles happened. So we then pulled a trace log, which is basically a list of all the instructions that happened on that frame, and had to study it and figure out what's different in this trace log from things that every emulator developer have tried to account for before. And they found something where a series of interrupts happened that we didn't know was possible, or nobody would ever design if they intended to have that series of interrupts happen normally. And we were able to then build a test ROM for that exact series of interrupts happening, capture that behavior, get it fixed in the emulator, and then remake, because we had to rewrite the task then, right? Because tasks are deterministic. If something fails at 2 billion CPU cycles in, you have to rewrite the whole rest of the task afterwards.
Yeah, we throw off, sometimes we can hex edit things, but usually when you find some improvement or change you have to make earlier on in your run, you have to throw out everything after that and start over.
So then I had to do another 2 weeks of just like tasking the rest of the game again, and then it fully synced on the console after fixing that one blast bug.
Well, luckily, Pokemon's not like a really long game or anything.
No, it's only like 360,000 frames that you have to check.
Yeah, it's fun.
Frame by frame.
It's just a Tuesday.
Okay, so with all of that implemented, this exposed the potential of task verification to improve emulation accuracy. Because by doing these task verifications of Pokemon Yellow, we were able to nail down problems in the emulator. And Mr. Wint applied the same concept like I had mentioned with the real-time clock to tasking. So we were able to do verifications of Pokemon Crystal after Pokemon Yellow with the cartridge RTC being perfect. And this is just insane, because you might have heard even stories of people like using the NES on a hot plate to get it to run at a different speed, and then...
Yeah, don't do that.
It's a thing you can do, not a thing you should do.
Yeah.
But so you can see then how tightly tuned it is. If you have like, you're talking about potentially emulating the CPU when it runs at 69 degrees Celsius or 70 degrees or Celsius, Fahrenheit.
That would be bad.
That would be bad. But you could emulate it much safer than you could do it on a real life system.
Emulate it melting down.
So yeah, we have to emulate basically what rate the console runs at a specific temperature, and what rate the cartridge runs at a specific temperature, and have those differences all tied together to get Pokemon Crystal working. And so that led to like I think it was almost a 3-hour-long console verification, which is about 12 billion CPU instructions being emulated to the same timing of the original console. Then after that, there were even further improvements. We took the game Mickey's Dangerous Chase, if you've ever heard of that one for the Game Boy. Mickey is like taking blocks and throwing them at various Disney properties in a little platformer. And we actually found a problem where the playing of gray Game Boy cartridges designed for the original Game Boy was not quite accurate enough when they were played on the Game Boy Color. There's a whole different PPU mode for that. They call it CGB Color Game Boy on DMG, dot matrix Game Boy. And that behavior had to be improved, and we got those LCD timings figured out. And then once those timings were in place, it really started to be like, oh, the bulk of our games are verifying, and now we have over 50 games that we can play back on the original hardware. Another fun one was Donkey Kong 94. You might have played that one. It's kind of like a hybrid platformer Donkey Kong game in one thing. And that one didn't work quite right at first because when you start up the console, there's non-deterministic RAM. It actually is working at a very low electrical level. You don't know whether it's going to be 0 or 1 in every state in the RAM when the console starts up. But it tends to have these patterns of this thing might usually be 0, might usually be 1. And we have to actually mirror that state in the emulator, but we still can't quite get it perfect every time because it's not deterministic. So we have to actually run programs that set the console to be a specific state, like all 0s or all 1s in the RAM, and then restart the hardware so that the div, basically the time counter goes back to 0, but without clearing out the state of the RAM. If you leave it powered on, the RAM will stay all 0s or all 1s are rewritten to it.
And we've done that many, many, many times with Final Fantasy on the NES. There are many NES games that will either seed memory or will try to figure out, is this game reset? I'll just check this one bit in this one place. Oh, it just happened to be a 1 because of the startup state, so let's not actually initialize anything. Many TASes are set with the expectation that the entire memory on startup is deterministic. And in many cases, like TAS Videos has essentially a rule on the initial RAM to keep things consistent.
Although we made some mistakes in the emulation of this too, which is its own topic.
Yeah, you could say something like, oh, just by random quantum fluctuations, my save state happened to be the end of the game.
Yeah.
Cosmic radiation.
Yeah, it is kind of frustrating because a lot of earlier emulators, especially FCUX, used a bizarre pattern for their starting memory state that was neither all 0s or all FFFF, in other words, all 1s. It was this weird interlinked combination of a few 0s, a few 1s, a few 0s, a few 1s, just repeating for arbitrary reasons, just because. So now we have, which totally is not accurate to how a real console works.
Yeah. So this importance in startup states is pretty clear in Donkey Kong 94, and we were able to get that process working where the console could be set to a specific startup state that matched how the TASers were writing the tasks for Donkey Kong 94. And then another cool thing was we took this test automation approach that had been vetted out by people like Blarg and Cinemas in the early 2010s and combined it with the learnings from these TASes to build a automation suite. So we actually now can take all of the existing console verified TASes and pipe their inputs back into emulators where we see, oh, if you take this TAS and you play it in SaneBoy or another very accurate emulator, it's missing this feature because we can tell this game relies on this feature being emulated accurately, and essentially the original game library for a console becoming a test automation suite for these low-level bugs in the consoles. A goal with this eventually might be to build something like Dade's emulator shootout. There's this emulator shootout that goes through a whole bunch of test ROMs and figures out which emulators are the best at emulating specific Game Boy behaviors. And we're thinking about the ability now of potentially doing the same thing with this console verification suite where we could run that battery against all these different Game Boy emulators and see which ones are the most accurate. There's a couple other end notes here, but I want to get to the one final bit of my overarching view here, which is don't use Visual Boy Advance. Please don't. Please do not use Visual Boy Advance. Yes, clap, please. Exactly. Don't use Visual Boy Advance. Awesome. Okay, we're all on the same page there. That's great. So the problem with Visual Boy Advance, there's a couple, but one was that it was mostly trying to get games to work. Even games that were ROM hacks that did not work on the original console, they made like quirks in the emulator to make the ROM hacks work. So doing things like emulating a function for real-time clock that didn't exist on the original console just because they wanted a ROM hack to be able to use it. And these incorrect implementations encouraged development of ROM hacks that no longer play on modern emulators. So that was pretty problematic. And another problem with Visual Boy Advance was the way it was implemented in a lot of larger frameworks like BizHawk led to it running at the wrong frame rate. So it would run at 60 FPS instead of the original 59 point whatever on the Game Boy. And it had ignorance also of hardware load times. So if something might take 5 seconds to load on the original console, Visual Boy Advance doesn't care. It wants to get straight into the game. So it'll only take as much time as it needs to actually load up the data. So all of this lack of focus on accuracy meant that a lot of games don't play on Visual Boy Advance where you'd like them to.
You know, one of my first events with TASBot, I made the wonderful mistake of going, oh yeah, we can just use Visual Boy Advance for this, it'll be fine, we'll just throw that up on stage, no big deal. And I thought Dwango was gonna come over the table at me. I'm just a random nobody, and he's screaming at me, no, this is a bad idea. So yeah, you guys all clap, but it was a hard lesson for some of us.
Well, thank you guys all for listening to the story there with emulation accuracy for the Game Boy. If you want to get involved, you can talk about console verification at discord.tas.bot. That's the process where we take these TASes and we play them back on original hardware. TASing is also larger discussed at TAS videos/live chat. You can find all our links to Discord, IRC, all those things if you still use IRC for some reason. You can find me, TyKevin83, on Twitter and Twitch, and TyKevin83 Speedruns on YouTube, where I do a lot of these console verification videos and other things. Especially also with the relaunch of the TAS Videos website. We have a whole brand new TAS Videos website that supports HTTPS and dark mode, and it's very beautiful. So if you enjoy TASing, I would love if you guys could check that stuff out. And now to wrap up, I'm going to give you guys a little live demo here quick of how all of this actually plays out when we do a console verification on hardware.
While he's setting that up, and hopefully the mic isn't too hot, I do want to say thank you to everyone in my community, including these fantastic folks that do all of the things that make this possible. There isn't one person who has all of the skills necessary to do everything, and having folks like Vigray Tech that can do a lot of the low-level hardware hacking, TyKevin, who has done a lot of the very specific work you've heard about today, Taters, who does a lot of the project management of all the crazy things we get involved in, and a whole bunch of other folks. They're just really blessed to have such a huge community. So get involved, discord.tas.bot, come join us.
So what you're seeing now here is called Swiss. It's a homebrew framework, basically to load whatever homebrew you want on the GameCube. So we basically just gained total control of the GameCube by turning it on with the action replay disc inserted. Usually, Dwango, when he's doing total controls of consoles, takes a bit more elaboration on it for comedic effect.
I want to get to it first.
And then all we do when we want to do a verification is I have these copies of Game Boy Interface being the replacement for the original startup disc on the Game Boy player. And it allows us to do that thing I was talking about where we take the inputs from the SD card and send them to the GameCube and the Game Boy player. So if I run GBISR, my copy pointing at the yellow glitchless inputs, you should see it now playing back Pokemon Yellow perfectly.
The audio isn't important, right?
No, the audio. The key is the video anyway. And you can see also in the upper left, there's an input display available in Game Boy Interface that shows you all of the inputs that the TAS is doing. It's a little bit dark. It's a little bit hard to see which buttons are which there. But I love this effect too when we pull out the controller port.
Yeah, because it keeps going. Basically, TASBot doesn't actually, he's just a mascot.
It reset itself while I was pulling out the controller port.
Of course
You
it did.
messed with it.
You messed up the live demo. One of the things that has made this a little interesting is it used to be that TASBot would hold a physical device connected to the controller ports, and obviously this is running entirely self-contained, which kind of breaks the, what's the right word?
The illusion?
Yeah, that's probably the best word. But on the other hand, trust me, this is for the best. I can't tell you how terrifying some of the Games Done Quick events were because walking across the carpet and touching the console, or a bunch of other random things.
TASBot is very good at holding boxes.
Yes.
So if we can just strengthen the arms, we
Yes.
might be able to hold this box.
Maybe. The whole thing, like just hold the
We
entire
could just give them the controller. I think that would work too.
That
You
would
don't have to hold the whole GameCube.
I just love, anytime I see that, I just love watch. I get sucked into it. Does anybody else have, or anybody, not else, we haven't even opened up the discussions yet. Does anybody have questions about Game Boy emulation, TASBot and its approach with Game Boy emulation, any of these things? That's a great question. There's positives and negatives. We could potentially strap inputs into it a little bit easier, have like, not have to worry about like programming Game Boy interface for the GameCube. It's a closed source system from Extremes, so there are benefits potentially to a consoleizer, but there are also downsides because I believe the way that the current consoleizer works by default out of the factory is that it replaces the clock of the Game Boy Advance with a 60 hertz clock, so it runs slightly faster. So it's less useful for speedrunning and TASing communities, but I know also that, at least from what I've read about it, that the developer is able to do implementations of the consoleizer firmware that run at the 59.7 rate of the original system. So when it's doing it that way, that's really useful and could be a potential improvement in the future. When it, with the way that it ships out of the factory and how we've built this stack already with the Game Boy player, I think we're content to continue using it this way.
And yes, they just take out Pikachu right away.
Yeah, it's faster for Pikachu to die there. Did you have a question over here? Yeah, it's an emulation speed thing. So if you take a console and you want to drive its emulation at a per cycle step, each of those cycles is going to take a lot of processing power to figure out. But if instead you kind of just like let the system kind of more like how JavaScript works, where it says, hey, I'm going to have an event now that happened when you clicked something on the document. If you use that sort of system for driving an emulator, it can do all of the processing as a batch for everything that's happened since the last event. And that is, it makes it a lot faster to do all that processing at once than just like process a little bit and then step and then process a little bit. Any more questions?
I think they're mesmerized by Pokemon.
That tends to, yeah, like I said, I get drawn in anytime I see that playing itself perfectly.
I'm glad we don't have to hear the audio, because when Pikachu goes down, there is a very saddening sound.
Yeah.
And harsh.
Sad Pikachu noises.
The Game Boy was not supposed to be able to play full audio tracks. It's not designed that way. It's designed for, like, I'm going to play this pitch or play this, like, bending pitch. And people have done insane things, even as far back as the original Pokemon Yellow, to make it try to play sounds that sound like actual talking or music and all these things. And one of the things was the scream that Pikachu does when it dies in Pokemon, and it sounds very, very disturbing.
So the way, and there's a wonderful video from Retro Game Mechanics Explained talking about it. So it, essentially the volume will go from 100% to 0% and flip back and forth. So it has a little bit more control over the frequencies that it can do, because air is just wiggling up and down, and going from 100% to 0% is wiggling up and down. But it's like 1-bit audio, and it's very harsh.
Yeah, very harsh.
I don't know, I kind of like it, a little nostalgic. You guys you're too hard on it. It's doing the best it can.
I mean, also, Pikachu basically cries when it's taken out, and it's taken out very early in this run.
All right. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. If you want to come up and talk to us, we're available. We'll be here all weekend with the event. We have some speedruns happening.
We do have some things. So there's a lot more interesting stuff happening with TASBot. This is the brand new TASBot. He looks really nice. Nice and dapper today. If you want to see him play some video games where he actually has to connect to the controller ports, check out MAGFest. We're not yet sure exactly where they're going to slot us on the schedule, but it'll be sometime tomorrow. We're doing about 13 different runs in an hour and a half. So if you like Mario, we're doing Mario 1, 2, 3, Mario World, Mario 1 in Mario World, because why not? Super Mario Brothers in Super Mario World, it's a thing. P4+2 is an amazing, amazing coder. We're doing a bunch of Super Mario 64 runs. Also, if you are into the dance scene and have ever heard of the Pump It Up series, we have a special treat for you. We have a cartridge that came out of Korea. We have the only known copy of it, and we're trying to restore or recover the data off of it. We're about halfway there. Hope that we can get some more progress in the next 24 hours before the Pump It Up talk, but no matter what, it'll be an interesting conversation on how to retrieve or how to preserve our digital heritage, how to keep these things from sliding into obscurity and being lost to time. So it's an interesting talk. By all means, swing by for that. There's also a Celebrity Versus. TASBot will be making a guest appearance at, and at some point tomorrow, there will be an opportunity for you to hold TASBot and take pictures. So swing by the autograph area for that. Again, I'd like to thank everyone here who is here because this is just such an awesome thing to work on. This is so much more than just me. There's a lot of people that are incredibly smart and talented that get involved in this project. And if you want to be involved, head on over to discord.tas.bot. It's a wonderful community. There's some fantastic people there.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Have a great MAGFest.